Bom dia a todos. Gabriel corre riscos. Bom dia a todos. Vamos a dar comienzo a nossa novena conferência. Eu queria agradecer a presença dos professores Martin Kusch e Ariana Beth, assim como do professor Kreihnen, que vai chegar ainda, do professor Luiz Nil, do professor Hernan Pringe e de nosso velho amigo, professor Guilherme Frecheta. Como vocês sabem, nós fazemos esta conferência todo ano e trazemos todo ano aquelas pessoas que podem ser interlocutores para os temas que trabalhamos. Bom, eu queria agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a todos aqueles que colaboraram para que este evento fosse possível, sobretudo o grupo que organizou o congresso, que trabalhou muito e trabalhou muito bem. E nossa proposta é que nas manhãs vamos ter a conferência de um professor internacional, aí vai ter um debatedor que vai abrir a discussão, e à tarde teremos 3 brasileiros estrangeiros, né, porque brasileiros são poucos realmente, não são canadienses, alemães, uruguaios, argentinos. E, finalmente, teremos a sessão de comunicações. E procederemos com o mesmo esquema desde a terça até a sexta. Então, eu vou dar a palavra para o professor Martin Kusch, que vai fazer a sua exposição, e depois o professor Gabriel Ferreira, da Unicinos, vai iniciar a interlocução. Então, bitte, Herr Professor Kusch.
Okay, can you all hear me? All right, okay. There is a handout. I think there's one left, and there's also, I understand, a Brazilian translation of my text, so if anyone wants to have that. So first of all, let me say thank you very much for the invitation to come to Brazil, and to you for coming to attend my talk. I was a little bit unsure exactly how much I was supposed to send material and how much I was going to speak. So I sent something which is quite long, but then I realized yesterday that I was not supposed to speak quite so long. So I'm going to now contract it again, which is easy because what I sent you was really a talk based on 3 different papers. And I'm simply going to leave out the first 2 papers, not talk about them, and just focus on the 3rd paper. But I'm not quite sure what my commentator has prepared. So I'm happy to, of course, also comment on, defend, summarize the first 2 papers. So what I will start with, for those of you who have the handouts, which is basically my PowerPoints, I will start on slide number 92, which is the 3rd paper. So as those of you who have looked at it will have noticed, the first paper focuses on Simmel and pragmatism, the 2nd paper on Simmel and Nietzsche, and the 3rd paper focuses on Simmel and the relationship between philosophy and sociology, and this is the paper I'm going to focus on. But before I go into the papers, actually, I want to look at a couple of slides from the start, because other than many of the other philosophers we will be discussing here, like Frege, Cassirer, the Neo-Kantians, Simmel is, of course, not that well known. And so I thought I should start by simply telling you 2 sentences about who the man was. So he was born in 1859, roughly the same time as Edmund Husserl. And in some respects, his career path took a similar turn. So Simmel studied in Berlin. He was a Protestant of Jewish descent, just like Husserl. He did his PhD in 1880 on Kant. He originally tried to do his PhD on Darwin's theory of language. but that PhD was rejected by Hermann von Helmholtz, who told Simmel that he didn't know enough about physiology. Simmel then submitted a different text, a text that had already won a prize for Kant scholarship. That then became his PhD. He did his Habilitationsthesis in 1883, again on Kant. He then became a Privatdozent, so a lecturer paid for giving a certain, paid basically per lecture course. He was highly successful. Between 1885 and 1914, so over a 30-year period, he tried to get a chair in a German or Austrian university, was unsuccessful until 1914. I've written a separate paper about the reasons for that. It had a lot to do with Simmel's background, being of Jewish descent. This was, of course, just like in the case of Husserl, a major hurdle for getting an academic position. But additionally, Simmel did not just have the Jewish disadvantage, but he also was politically on the left, and he wrote for social democratic and other left-wing journals, and that, of course, was also a big problem. So to be a Jew and on the left was almost like the killer blow. It must be added, though, that he also was distinctly impolite in his academic manners. So, for example, when he defended his Habilitationsthesis, Zeller was the grand old man of Berlin philosophy, and Simmel declared Zeller incompetent during the discussion of his Habilitations lecture, whereupon the Habilitations lecture was rejected. And the faculty said, come back in 6 months when you have learned manners. So Simmel went back, he learned a few manners, and so he got his Habilitation. He then, in 1900, just the same time as Husserl, became an unpaid extraordinarius professor. So this was basically to be a professor, but not be allowed to supervise PhD students. So when you were extraordinarius, you could not build a school in this German sense. And of course, a professor's influence long-term depended on having students. So Simmel really never had his own PhD students. And then in the same year as Husserl, he got then eventually a chair in Strasbourg. But of course, you know what happened in 1914. Strasbourg was part of Germany at the time, but of course the French lost the Alsace-Lorraine region in 1871, and the French wanted to have first and foremost that region back. So it was a highly politically charged atmosphere. Simmel also was a little bit politically, well, how should we put it, uncautious in that time. Because just when the war started, just after the war had started, Simmel wrote a newspaper article for Dagens Nyheter, the Swedish newspaper, in which he said, guilt for the war is on all sides. Whereupon the general commander in Strasbourg wanted Simmel arrested and lose his job. And then all sorts of political figures had to weigh in to protect Simmel from facing that punishment. He then started writing for Germany, the way in which most German philosophers, unfortunately, at the time did, and of course Bergson did on the French side in like reverse. And then in 1918, Simmel died of cancer. Okay, so this is roughly his life. Here are his main works. So you see there's lots of them. His writings straddle the divide between philosophy and the social sciences. So the book Über soziale Differenzierung, on social differentiation, is a book that is regarded as an important classic in sociology. The problem of history of philosophy is an important contribution to debates over historicism, debates over how to reflect on what the historical sciences actually do. Die Einleitung in die Moralwissenschaft is a book I will return to. It's basically a book that claims we don't need ethical preachers anymore. Ethics should become a science, and ethics becomes a science by being based on the social sciences. So it basically was saying we have to replace philosophy with the social sciences. I'll also say a bit more about his Philosophy of Money book. Then after that Philosophy Money book and its rather negative reception, Simmel turned himself into a more traditional German philosopher. So, and what does a good German traditional philosopher do at the time? Well, he writes a book about Kant. And even better if he writes a book about Kant and Goethe. Simmel had also promised to next write a book about Beethoven. Well, if he had done that, he would have had a chair much earlier, I'm sure. Then he writes about religion before Durkheim, but in a very interestingly similar spirit, but it straddles the border between philosophy and the social sciences. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche was an interesting book because it defended Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, whereas German academic philosophy at the time standardly tried to refute Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. In 1908 is a book on sociology, but we would now classify much of the book as philosophy of the social sciences, really, because it really tries to look at the very foundations of social sciences and analyze them from philosophical perspectives. Probleme der Philosophie was one of the most successful German philosophy books ever, not until the book by Sloterdijk, Zynische Vernunft. Until then, it was the most sold German philosophy book, not counting Haeckel and not counting Marx. So take those out, and it sold like in the first 2 years, 25,000 copies. Philosophical Culture is a collection of papers. Goethe, again, a very conventional book at the time. Rembrandt, also, you might know that in the 1890s, there was a famous book, Der Rembrandt-Deutsche, Langbehn, where like Rembrandt was presented as the classical ideal of what a German should be, with plenty of anti-Semitic and racial overtones. The book in which he tries to present his own vision of what the war meant for Germany and its future is in 1917. But the reason why I hate this book is because I'm interested in Simmel, not least because of his self-professed relativism. So at a time when everyone tried to prove that they are not relativists, Simmel came out and said, well, I am a relativist and I defend it. But that only was true until this book about the war, because in this book about the war, he says, well, the war has changed many things for us. And one of the things it has changed is that we have seen that they are absolutes. And Germany, the idea of Germany, that's an absolute. So forget all the relativism. German nationalism, that's absolute, which of course to me is like selling out to the cheapest of nationalistic things. Then there was another interesting book about the foundations of sociology in 1917. And then the book that subsequently was influential because it develops a original form of philosophy of life, this book Lebensanschauung from 1918. It influenced Heidegger, for example. So Heidegger's analysis of death in Being and Time owes a lot to the chapter on death in this book by Simmel. So this is the Simmel 101 quick run through. So now I will not talk about the interesting relationship between Simmel and pragmatism. In this paper, I basically try to find out, analyze what is the relationship between Simmel and pragmatism. Some people say Simmel really is a pragmatist. Some people say Simmel isn't a pragmatist. Simmel himself sometimes says, I'm the only genuine good pragmatist, and on other occasions he says, I've got nothing to do with pragmatism. So I tried to sort this out, and I claim that he is really a pragmatist throughout, but when pragmatism became increasingly the opponent for German philosophy, especially after the Heidelberg Congress in 1908, then Simmel distances himself from it, even though he keeps many of the central ideas. So that's the first paper. I'm going to be finished very quickly if I keep going at that speed. The second paper, I really enjoyed doing because it tried to make sense of this difficult book by Simmel on Moralwissenschaft, one where he says we need to replace morals with something else. And it really helped me to try to understand some of the arguments in the book by relating it to the much better known controversy between Reh and Nietzsche. You might know that Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals sees as his central opponent Reh, his former friend and with whom he lived together, and Lou Salome, they had this sort of threesome relationship. And so for Nietzsche, Re is the essential opponent. Re very much is oriented according to Spencer and the English tradition, whereas, of course, Nietzsche is also quite influenced by it, but then turns against it. So there's this tension, Re-Simmel, and it seemed to me that, Re-Nietzsche, and it seemed to me that Simmel's position really can be read as an attempt to mediate between those two extremes. So that to me was an eye-opener in my understanding of Simmel, but I'm not saying that should be of interest to anyone else. Read Simmel in the context in which he's normally not much read. Okay, so that's Simmel and Nietzsche and Re, and now I move on to the third paper that I will now present more properly, namely Simmel on the relationship between philosophy and sociology. So the paper has 5 parts, and let me jump in and begin with the introduction. So in this paper, I want to analyze Georg Simmel's changing conceptions of the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences, and in particular between philosophy and sociology. And I think the topic, and I hope the topic, is interesting both historically and for systematic reasons. Historically, I think it's important because Simmel wrote at a time when the social sciences in Germany were at the brink of becoming separate disciplines with their own professorships and institutes. Moreover, Simmel's work throughout his career, as we have seen, straddled what he himself and his contemporary perceived as the emerging boundaries between philosophy, sociology, and history. And this put him intellectually and institutionally in a complicated but intriguing position. Simmel's critics and colleagues wondered about the following questions. Was he really a philosopher, or was he really a sociologist? Or could one be both? Simmel thought one could be both. But what did it mean to be both? Did it mean being a Marxist, as many of Simmel's critics feared? Did it mean using the social sciences to critique or even declare obsolete influential philosophical positions? Or did it mean to do philosophically for the social sciences what Kant and the Neo-Kantians had so influentially done for the natural sciences, and what the Neo-Kantians in Simmel's days were doing for history, namely to understand how the historical and natural sciences constitute their subject matter? Obviously, I won't be able to answer all of these questions here, but it seems to me as a first step towards answering them, we need to get as clearly as possible on how Simmel himself thought on the relationship between the social sciences and philosophy. So that's the historical interest, I hope. But I think the topic is also of philosophical or systematic interest, because the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences is still, or is again, in many ways problematic today. On the one hand, one might well say that the philosophy of the social sciences, which was a big deal in the 1950s and 60s, is making something of a revival today, at least judging by the amount of conferences in this area. Social, political, and feminist epistemologies seek to respond to and sometimes to integrate sociological results. And the sociology of scientific or the sociology of philosophical knowledge is taken seriously by philosophers and historians of philosophy. All this invites more general reflection on the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences. And Simmel, I submit, is one useful interlocutor in this regard, not because he got things right, but because he experimented with different options in thought-provoking ways, and options that in many ways still exist today and are still important today. Okay, turning then to my main thesis in this paper, I submit that we can find 3 main models for the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences in Simmel. The first model, essential in this aforementioned book, Introduction to the Moral Sciences of 1892-93, it came in 2 volumes, and can be dubbed the replacement model. this is the idea that the social sciences replace philosophy after a, what we might call, sociological genealogy has debunked existing philosophical concepts and conceptions. The second model is the model of the Philosophie des Geldes of 1900. In its case, I shall speak of the tight coupling model. The social sciences and philosophy interpret each other's ideas, critique each other, and draw on each other's work. And the third model is the neo-Kantian model of 1908 and 1917. Here, sociology is one-sidedly dependent upon philosophy. So it's almost like the flipped version of the original replacement model. Now philosophy, in fact, replaces sociology in many key areas. So let me conclude by introduction with a word of caution. In distinguishing Simmel's three models in this way, I do, of course, abstract away from a host of more fine-grained variations and complexities. But sometimes it's better to have a bold thesis and then correct it later than to be so overcautious right from the start. Okay, so let's start with the replacement model. And I shall do that in several steps. So let me first give you the basic idea of the Einleitung in die Moralwissenschaft. The main idea is that in order to turn ethics into moral science, a term that obviously Simmel adopts from the English context, it needs to be broken up into different social historical sciences. A form of psychology focused on those, quote, individual volitions, feelings, and judgments that are counted as moral or immoral. A form of social science studying those forms and contents of social life that cause or hinder moral progress. And third, a form of history, leading moral phenomena back to their most primitive forms and thus studies historical influences on morality. When these fields have done their work, Simmel suggests, it is, quote, questionable whether ethics as a special science will survive. For example, Simmel claims that a study of English labor law tells us more about egoism and altruism than any philosophical dissection of these concepts. His criticism of prevalent basic moral concepts like freedom, egoism, and happiness starts from the claim that they are condensations, Verdichtungen, of heterogeneous elements. This, Simmel suggests, makes them as useless in today's as in today's chemistry are the four elements, or as in today's biology are the old static concepts of species. To make matters worse, he says, the basic moral concepts are often reified into real mental powers. And the overall purpose of the book is to pave the way for the replacement of ethics by the social sciences by offering what I propose calling a sociological genealogy of received ethical concepts and ideas. It is a form of genealogy insofar as it tries to trace back current concepts to their most primitive motivations. And it is sociological, since the background suggestions on how to do the genealogy often come from Spencerian sociology. We might also call what he's trying to do here a sociology of philosophical knowledge. I cannot here summarize a 900-page book, so to illustrate Simmel's arguments, I shall here only give the briefest of summaries of chapter 5 of the book on the categorical imperative, which is easiest to approach. And in this paper on Re and Nietzsche, I analyze the chapters on egoism and altruism and freedom, but I won't repeat this here. So let's focus then on the example of the categorical imperative. Simmel starts from the observation that Kant takes moral guidelines to have the character of imperatives that are generally valid. And Simmel questions whether this combination, imperative and general validity, is obvious and intuitive, the way Kant seems to suppose. And he suggests that Kant's intuition here explained by what Simmel calls, the social origin of the moral demand. In primitive societies of our past, Simmel says, the behavior of the majority was experienced as an imperative for the individual. The individual ought to behave as everyone does. But it is not clear, Simmel says, that we should still stick to this intuition. For instance, he says, we might, following Nietzsche, value individuality and difference more than general acceptance. Thus, it would make little sense to ask for a Nietzschean, what if everyone did it? Or we might, following socialist ideas, allow that societies could change radically over time. Under such conditions, Simmel thinks, the categorical imperative would be unhelpful as a test. Typically, maxims promoting radical change would not be generalizable under the old ideological conditions. That was a typical Marxian criticism of Kant's ethics at the time. Putting these objections to one side, the categorical imperative also suffers from the difficulty that in order to appropriately test whether our maxim can be generalized, we need to distinguish between essential and accidental features of our situation. And Kant does not tell us how to do that. At this point, Kantian ethics, Simmel thinks, remains dependent upon the very everyday morality it seeks to replace. A similar problem surfaces when we consider the question of how we should evaluate the imagined situation in which everyone acts on my maxim. Which moral principles should we use for this assessment? Kant, this is a topic that Simmel frequently returns to, Simmel seeks to avoid this problem of having to use morality in order to evaluate morality. Kant seeks to avoid the problem by focusing on a logical conceptual issue. That is, the question whether my wanting the imagined situation involves me in a contradiction. For example, Kant thinks that I cannot want everyone to lie, for then there would be no assertions and thus no lies. As Simmel has it, the underlying idea of Kant's reasoning is roughly this, quote, every concept of human practice carries within itself and its logical consequences the norm that regulates our conduct with that very concept's instances. And Simmel finds this solution unworkable. Taking a page out of Kant's own book, he applies Kant's critique of the ontological argument, mutatis mutandis. My maxim, to lie, is ruled out by Kant's test only if I want there to be lies in the first place, or if I want there to be assertions in the first place. And Simmel sees Kant's use of logic to support moral theory as having a long ancestry, tracing it back to Socrates, from Socrates to Hegel. In each case, he thinks there is an attempt to liken the practical to the theoretical. And Simmel submits that this move is often motivated by the idea that morality, like nature, is, quote, objectively given and independent of our will and thus discovered rather than invented. The discovery view, morality is discovered rather than invented, Simmel thinks, has an underground connection, as he calls it, to religious ethics. God ordains the moral laws, and hence they are objectively there for us to discover them. The invention view, the opposite view that Simmel tries to promote instead, insists that morality is created by groups and individuals. Proponents of this view attack Kant for falsely hypostatizing our volitions. Simmel thinks that the two views, the discovery versus invention, may be due to, quote, fundamental differences of character, and that they are linked to, quote, conservative or progressive tendencies, respectively. The discovery view often implies past success, Simmel laments. namely the idea that we have already discovered much or most of the morality there is, and thus there is no justification for new values. Although Simmel sides with what he calls the nominalism of the invention view, he also seeks sociological explanations for why the moral concept realism of the discovery view might seem initially so obvious. And he explains this by saying that a concept is a selective condensation of aspects of beliefs and evaluation, picking up, of course, as essential concept and idea of the Herbartian tradition, the idea of concepts as condensations of past experiences. So a concept is a selective condensation of aspects of beliefs and evaluation. It is based on similarity judgments guided by interests. And he explains this in some detail by analyzing the concept of Lohnarbeiter, wage worker. He's trying to explain that it took a specific social economic development to make this group of human beings salient to a linguistic community. Writing, quote, "Real historical forces move the species to form concepts that under different conditions would have been impossible." And so this sentence combines an allusion to the Marxist tradition, real historical forces. Of course, the very term Lohnarbeiter he looks at also signals that, but he combines it with the Spencerian history of the species. Put differently, the realms of ought and the realm of being meet each other in our concepts. It is this fact which makes it intuitively compelling to use the logic of concepts, Simmel thinks, to determine moral demands. So that's the genealogy, if you like, of Kantian morality. And Simmel finds the same, what he calls rationalist deductive ethics, also in other cultures. Quoting, for example, Confucius, "The prince should be a prince, the subject, the father, a father, the son, a son." That, of course, makes sense as a meaningful moral demand only if you think that the concepts already contains the morality. Simmel also marshals association psychology as part of his explanation for Kant's intuitions. For Kant, there is a strong association between assertion and truth. This, Simmel thinks, makes it natural for Kant to mistake the link for a logical truth. There are similar strong associations between the category of the human and certain rights. Simmel does not object to these associations, but he reminds his reader that here too the association is ultimately a psychological phenomenon and as such a contingent fact. Simmel spends many pages to explore the affinities between what he calls epistemological nominalism, namely the idea that we do not need to grasp universals in order to understand particulars, ethical individualism, the individual morality is prior to socially shared morality, and social ontology, individuals are prior to communities. So Simmel is trying to establish a relationship between an epistemological thesis, an ethical thesis, and a social ontological thesis. And he does the same for the opposite triad of epistemological realism. We need to grasp universals in order to understand particulars. Ethical collectivism, communal morality is prior to individual morality, and social ontological collectivism, namely communities are prior to individuals. And he also tries to use this distinction to analyze the history of philosophy. So he says the sophists or Locke defended the first triad, Socrates and Plato the second. And Simmel hopes that one day differential psychology, so the psychology of individual differences, a big boom area in his day, might explain why some philosophers choose one triad and other philosophers use another. Simmel suspects that there are many causal links between these different elements, but he finds the triads useful even if we just use them as vague analogies. Simmel also offers the observation that in his own time, ethical collectivism is on the rise. It is because we become increasingly aware of what he calls the social historical character of all knowledge concerning the human being, unquote, that, quote, the social tendency of morality seems unavoidable. Concerning epistemological realism and ethical collectivism, Simmel makes the point that we would nowadays associate with Durkheim, namely, quote, that the relationship between individual and God is often a symbol for the individual's relationship to the community. And finally, and to bring it all back to the categorical imperative, Simmel insists that it is a product of the second triad, epistemological realism, ethical collectivism, and social ontological collectivism. This should not come as a surprise, since this triad is just spelling out what Simmel had earlier called the discovery view in Kant. Okay, let me sum up what I want to take away from this book. Ethics needs to be replaced by moral science, a combination of psychology, social science, and history. The replacement is prepared by a sociological genealogy, or sociology of philosophical knowledge, if you will, that uncovers the dubious and contradictory social condensations in key ethical concepts and ideas. For instance, the categorical imperative condenses conservative and religious assumptions. It can be used, Simmel thinks, to block radical social change or the valuing of individuality. So it wasn't totally unjust when the leading social democratic newspaper of the time did a review of the book, saying that Simmel unmasks Kant's ethics as the product of a petit bourgeois. That's what people took away from the book. What about other writings of the same periods? I will just say very briefly that they don't necessarily have exactly the same model. So in Über soziale Differenzierung of 1870, Simmel uses the same critical apparatus, trying to show that sociological concepts are also problematic condensations. But in this case, he doesn't think that's a reason to abandon sociology. He rather thinks that's a reason to make sociology better. In another book, The Probleme der Geschichtsphilosophie, that is already quite Kantian. There he's quite close to what many Kantian commentators on history are concerned, but there are also elements in common with the book on moral science, namely that he says the a priori of historical research is partly psychological, partly biological, partly cultural historical. That's not what Rickert would have said. Epistemology, he said, should be descriptive rather than normative, also doesn't fit with neo-Kantian assumptions. He thinks that, quote, psychology is the a priori of history as a science, again, not your standard neo-Kantian. And he says traditional philosophy of history is merely a play or game, which of course also didn't fit with the neo-Kantian model. Okay, I now turn to what I call the tight coupling model of Simmel's Philosophie des Geldes of 1900. Since this is the best known of Simmel's texts and probably familiar to many of you, I shall not offer a direct summary of it. Instead, I shall pay more attention to the reception of the book, and via the reception also then say quite a bit about the content of the book. Of course, there would be lots to say also about the utterly negative reception of the Einleitung in die Moralwissenschaft, where I did not go into the reception except for this one reference. But since this issue has already been covered extensively in Christian Könke's study of the young Simmel, I shall simply leave it aside here. Okay, so I'll do this again in 5 steps, and I begin with a brief look at the preface of the book. So why do I speak of a tight coupling between philosophy and sociology in the Philosophie des Geldes? Well, here's why. Simmel tells us that philosophical epistemology clarifies the presuppositions of the sciences, and metaphysics speculatively augments the science's fragmentary contents into a world picture. So that's a broadly speaking neo-Kantian statement. But Simmel urges very strongly in the Philosophy of Money that the social sciences also at the same time investigate and criticize the presuppositions of philosophical theories. So while philosophy studies the foundations of the social sciences study the ideologies of the philosophies. For example, he thinks that historical materialism must have this critical perspective on philosophy. The preface also defends a form of epistemic pluralism. Social reality can be investigated from many different perspectives, including those of economics, the social sciences, and philosophy. And none of the perspectives is privileged. The specific perspective of philosophy, Simmel says, are, quote, connections of a conceptual, psychological, and ethical nature, ethics is making a partial comeback, that are not temporal, but purely objective. And of course, the philosophy of money is famously based on various forms of relativism, of which Simmel says it is the most appropriate expression of the contemporary contents of science and emotional currents. So here's a summary, just a table of content of the book. It has this analytic part and this synthetic part. So above, I have summarized on the basis of the preface how Simmel saw the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences in the abstract. He wanted the philosophy of money to be a philosophical book on the foundations of the social sciences when they concern money, covering many of the same phenomena already studied by the social sciences. And one question that one might ask here, how did people who read the book and received the book, did they get what Simmel was trying to do, namely create this tight coupling between philosophy and the social sciences? And the interesting thing is that reviewers did not get it. Reviewers struggled to make sense what the hell this book was trying to do. I mean, there's this element of desperation in the book reviews. So here's what people said about it. Carl Juel, for example, was sympathetic towards Simmel, says that the book gives a philosophy of time, a philosophy of our time, and is even better than Nietzsche. But he said what Simmel really ultimately gives is a psychology, namely the psychology of humankind. Emil Durkheim, in a scathing negative review of the book, says the book is really a treatise in social philosophy, not in sociology. Erich Adickes said that the first part of the book may be philosophical, but the second part of the book is purely sociological and not really of philosophical interest. Paul Hensel classified the second half of the book as general cultural history based on Simmel's sociology. George Herbert Mead commented that, quote, the treatment is not primarily economic but philosophic. In its aims, it is sociological, though it covers political economy and finance. Paul Ernst suggested that, quote, Simmel let sociology search for the ultimate motivations of thought in our time. The economist Solomon Paul Altmann first says that Simmel offers social psychological investigations, but says ultimately it's not really a work of science, it's a work of art. Max Frisch-Eisenköhler agreed. It said it's an expressionist work of art. The economist and Kathedersozialist, about whom I will talk a lot more, Gustav Schmoller, read Simmel as using historical and economic theories for, quote, sociological and philosophical purposes in order to draw psychological, social, scientific, and cultural conclusions. Well, that sounds like rather a mess. And if you then look into the detail of Schmoller's review, he says that Chapter 1 gives, quote, the psychological foundations of a theory of value. Chapter 2 gives the author's macroeconomic view of money. Chapter 3, the psychology of the money economy in all its aspects. Chapter 4 studies legal and economic institutions and their psychological effects. Chapter 5, a history of culture and customs. And Chapter 6 pulls together the results. So here philosophy has dropped out completely. So to sum up what this very quick look at the reviewers suggests is that people had a hard time understanding what Simmel was trying to do. And of course, this incomprehension in many ways continues to this day, even though sociologists all say it's a classic in sociology. I worked myself in the sociology department for a while, so I am even married to a sociologist. And I know from that context that very few sociologists today read more of Simmel than just 7 pages, namely the short text on The Stranger, which is an appendix to his 1908 sociology. That's what sociologists nowadays read of Simmel. Okay, so we need to do a little bit better than those reviewers, trying to locate a bit better why this book has this problematic character. So to understand that, we need to look a little bit at Simmel's background and Simmel's relationship with Schmoller, the famous Kathedersozialist, so one of these group of people who were trying to improve the condition of German workers, not really being socialists. They weren't trying to change the state, but they were trying to improve the working conditions. Whereupon the right wing in Germany, for example, the historian Treitschke and people and his students, called these people around Schmoller Kathedersozialisten, socialists on the professorial lectern. Schmoller did not have a chair in sociology. These chairs in sociology only came from 1908 onwards. Oppenheimer had the first chair in sociology, but rather had position in Staatswissenschaften, the sciences of the state, namely economics, law, economic history, fields that were meant to be studied by German civil servants in order to govern the state more effectively. And sociology grew out of the Staatswissenschaften. Okay, now, in his lengthy review of Simmel's book, the best review of the book by far, Schmoller reported that he had followed Simmel's work on money since 1889, so for 12 years, when Simmel gave a paper entitled The Psychology of Money in Schmoller's Colloquium. And in this paper, Simmel spoke of the Völker psychological developmental pattern, according to which money becomes ever more abstract, impersonal, and fluid. So Simmel here aligned himself with his main academic teacher, namely Lazarus. Lazarus and Steinthal, you remember, the founders of the Berlin School of Völkerpsychologie. Simmel in this 1889 paper also offered something of a sociology of philosophy. Namely, he claims that the development of ever more abstract ideas of money facilitated ever more abstract ideas of God. And these passages suggest that Simmel's interest in money had at least 2 sources. On the one hand, Schmoller's economic theorizing, and remember, Schmoller was doing a form of economics that, not like the Austrian school, tried to formalize in economics, but a form of economics essentially based on economic history. So Schmoller's theorizing about economic history was important for Simmel, but also Völkerpsychologie. And as far as Völkerpsychologie is concerned, it's interesting to remember that Lazarus was a great fan of Aaron David Bernstein, a left-wing German intellectual, who in 1874 wrote a very interesting short paper, a study of money, markets, and clocks. And many of Simmel's central motifs in his analysis of money first appear in this paper by Bernstein. So if that was Simmel's background, and he initially calls it a psychology of money, and draws so essentially on Schmoller and works in Schmoller's domain, why did Simmel call the book by 1900 a philosophy of money and no longer a psychology or sociology of money? Well, this is a long story. Let me just cut it down to the essential features. First of all, by 1900, Völkerpsychologie had become a liability. First, because it had played a central role in the Antisemitismus-Streit, because Lazarus was Treitschke's main opponents when Treitschke attacked the Jews in Germany. Lazarus defended the Jews in a book-length study. So from then on, Völkerpsychologie meant doing something the Jews do, unless you did it like Wundt did, but then that was a very different kind of Völkerpsychology. Second, Steinthal had tried to build a defense of socialism upon Völkerpsychological ideas. So in 1885, Steinthal writes an ethics, and in this ethics he says he defends socialism, the same salary for everyone, using Völkerpsychological ideas. So from then on, Völkerpsychology is tainted both ethnically, racially, it's Jewish, but it's also tainted as left-wing. So Simmel knew very clearly that with that combination, he had no chance in Germany to have an academic career. But Simmel could not really call it a sociology of money either. One thing you need to remember here, for example, that when the faculty in Berlin tried to get Simmel an extraordinarius position, Simmel was ultimately got it on the second attempt, but he got it without a salary. Normally an extraordinarius professor would get a salary, but Simmel did not get a salary. And when someone in the Prussian parliament, a member of parliament, challenged the minister for the university asking, why aren't you paying Simmel a salary? The minister for the universities replied, well, Simmel is merely a sociologist, meaning we don't pay for sociologists. So Simmel had every reason not to be labeled a sociologist. I mean, it's more complicated because Simmel inherited so much money from his parents and his godfather that, strictly speaking, he never needed a salary. He never needed a salary. He might need a summary, but he doesn't need a salary. But still, of course, it was a humiliation to be known to be one of the few extraordinarii in Berlin who did not get a salary. Okay, so with all these, I do not mean to deny that there may also well be theoretical reasons why Simmel moved away from this replacement model. Maybe Simmel came to realize the asymmetry in how he treated sociology and philosophy. In the case of philosophy, but not in the case of sociology, conceptual confusions motivated replacement. Okay, well, let me say a bit more about the Simmel-Schmoller connection, because I believe that the interaction with Schmoller during the 1890s is really important. And an important clue here is, first of all, that Schmoller repeatedly in the correspondence with Simmel voiced his dissatisfaction with the Moralwissenschaft book, saying that it's sociological and evolutionist and therefore purely negative. And the term purely negative was racially tainted because it was a standard trope of the time that Jews are unable to think productively. Jews can only think purely negatively. So Simmel had every reason not to be perceived in that form. And perhaps as a result of this criticism, quite curiously, when Simmel publishes a summary of the Moralwissenschaft in Schmoller's journal, he calls it a Sozialphilosophie, trying to show that he's not a sociologist. And given the attention that Schmoller showed Simmel during the 1890s, and despite using anti-Semitic slurs when talking about Simmel in private, suggests to me that Schmoller in fact groomed Simmel as someone who would give a philosophical underpinning for Schmoller's historical and psychological conception of economics. So Schmoller wanted an in-house philosopher, someone who can philosophically defend Schmoller's program against the Austrian school. And it seems to me that's what Schmoller expected Simmel to do. An additional clue is provided by Frisch-Eisen-Köhler's paper from 1918 in his very detailed discussion of Simmel. He namely suggests that the philosophy of money belongs with Sombart's, Trölsch, and Weber's studies of the Geist des Kapitalismus. So there was this whole wave of book-length studies of capitalism, all of which more or less directly were critiquing Marxism. And clearly the Kathedersozialist Schmoller was one of those people who were also doing what Sombart, Trölsch, and Weber were doing. And the thesis that Simmel's book belongs in that context is confirmed, for example, by Simmel's long and extended critique of the Marxian labor theory of value. For example, the only bibliographical reference in the whole book, so he writes a whole book with a single reference, and that reference is to Marx. And interestingly enough, in their reviews of the philosophy of money, the two economists, Schmoller and Altmann, focus centrally on Simmel's criticism of Marx and praise Simmel's criticism of Marx at great length. Okay, but for all the social scientific material in the philosophy of money, there clearly are also philosophical dimensions. After all, Simmel could, without changing in words, entitle his book a Philosophie des Relativismus. And it is somewhat puzzling that most reviewers did not find this aspect of the philosophy of money original. The philosophy of money, namely, also tries to give purely philosophical arguments for epistemic and ontological relativism. And it includes essentially a philosophy of history, according to which relativism and the modern money economy are products of the same historical forces. That is why Simmel thinks relativism adequately expresses the modern world. Many interpreters of the philosophy of money today, of course, for instance in Wuppertal, read the book as primarily a philosophy of culture. And indeed, Kulturphilosophie was taking off big time at the time. Ludwig Stein, for instance, in 1899, was the first to use the term Kulturphilosophie as a title for a book. And Simmel analyzes how individual so-called subjective culture is increasingly unable to make objective culture its own. This is his famous The Tragedy of Culture thesis. But of course, even the relativism thing wasn't just a philosophical thesis, it was also a social scientific claim. Because Simmel claims that his book follows a relativistic methodology. He says, a methodology where nothing is assumed absolute and everything must be understood in its relation to everything else. Or think of Simmel's so-called relativistic analysis of value. The value of X for person A is determined by what A is willing to sacrifice to get X. This was a familiar and much discussed position in economics at the time. Or remember that Simmel's whole analysis of the category of exchange is crucial. He calls exchange a sociological structure sui generis, quote, the purest and most intense interaction that shapes human life. Well, we know already that forms of interaction are the topic of sociology. And finally, let's not forget that methodological relativism holism extends to philosophy itself. Simmel offers a sociology of philosophy in which, for example, substance money and the metaphysics of stable substances went hand in hand. One more thought that occurs to me as I'm giving the talk, one more interesting historical link. When people nowadays write about Simmel's philosophy of money, they read the book very much in isolation. But what one needs to remember is that the period between 1880 and 1920 was a period of most intense theorizing about money the world over. I mean, it started with a financial crisis in the 1870s, where everyone realized what caused the crisis was financial matters, and it was also a time when so-called bimetallism, namely that money is backed up by both gold and silver, was replaced by gold standards as the central backing. And numerous people in the States and in Germany wrote huge books about Simmel. Everyone in Germany writes immediately 600 pages. The Americans, thankfully, write only 200 pages at a time. But there is an awful lot of theorizing. And one interesting task that I hope to tackle sometime in the not-too-distant future is to read Simmel's philosophy of money as a contribution to theorizing about money at the time. Okay. Again, Simmel falls between the cracks here, because when historians of economics write about finance and money, then Simmel is not on their radar, because Simmel is a sociologist. And when the Simmelians write about it, they never even though Simmel writes about money, they never make the link between Simmel and economics. Clearly, the link is absolutely crucial. Okay, let me finally come to the third model, the model I propose calling the Neo-Kantian model. My central text here are the Sociology of 1908 and the Grundfragen der Soziologie of 1917. And I begin with the book, the Soziologie from 1908. As in Simmel's earlier writings, sociology is studies very general forms of interaction. So that's the central topic, forms of interaction, not like for Durkheim, collective representations, but the central topic of sociology are forms of interaction. And sociology abstracts from contents, such contents being drives, interests, purpose, or inclination. And Simmel's description of the method of sociology quite strongly reminds one of Husserl's eidetic reduction. For example, he says, identifying the abstract forms of interaction requires first and foremost intuition. And he says, empirical phenomena are to be analyzed and interpreted in the light of pure and abstract constructs. And he says, it's not important for his research that he does any sort of fieldwork. He says only it's important that his examples are possible, not that they are real. It thus would make no difference, he says, if we only used invented examples. That's, of course, a very different methodology from what Durkheim does. And when I first gave this talk to a group of sociologists, they all said, no, there's nothing Husserlian there. But since then, maybe Simmel didn't even think of Husserl there, but it's interesting that many reviewers at the time picked up on the same thing that I noticed, namely that many of the ways in which he describes his method makes links to phenomenology. Simmel is also repeatedly concerned to insist that there's nothing psychologistic about sociology. Also, obviously, of course, a link to phenomenology. So in this vein, he argues that sociology is not reducible to or dependent upon psychology, especially individual psychology. He says, just like linguistics studies the structure of language, so sociology studies the structure or the grammar of interaction. Nor does he say, is sociology reducible to Völkerpsychologie or social psychology, and he rejects talks of Volksseele, which of course was a key topic in Völkerpsychologie. And he says objective contents, like legal systems, owe their existence to a, quote, plurality of psychological units interacting with one another. Simmel retains from the Philosophie des Geldes the idea that philosophy borders on sociology both from below and above. Epistemology studies presuppositions. Metaphysics draws ultimate conclusions beyond the factual. So, for example, philosophy seeks to answer questions like, is society merely a tool for the individual or vice versa? And are there cosmic parallels for social developmental laws? Those are metaphysical questions. And these issues, he says, make up the philosophy of society or social philosophy. We today would call it philosophy of the social sciences. There's no longer the aspect where philosophy is in turn critiqued by the social sciences. That element of interaction is dropped in 1908. Of course, one needs to remember, just in parenthesis, the context of the book in 1908. The book was published about 3 months into the very long and torturous fight over the chair in philosophy in Heidelberg in 1908. The chair where Weber and Simmel were trying to get Simmel appointed, but the Treitschkians in the background with letters from Berlin were making sure that Simmel was perceived as Jewish and as a socialist. And this combination meant that Simmel didn't get the job. So when Simmel is so cautious in saying what philosophy owes to the sociology, may of course also be in some way influenced by the context of his application. The neo-Kantian perspective becomes more prominent in essential excursus of the book, namely, how is society possible? And the fact that it's an excursus rather than a key chapter of the book suggests to me that it was added to the book quite late into the production process. And here he promises to give what he calls a priori conditions of the possibility of sociology. In Kant's philosophy, Simmel reminds us, the unity of nature, quote, comes about only in the observing subject, meaning in the analyst. In the case of society, however, quote, unity is brought about by conscious and synthesizing elements, namely the historical actors. So in the study of nature, the unity is provided by the outside observer. In the case of society, the unity is already in the subject matter itself. And this is why the epistemology of the social sciences must be, he says, an epistemology of society itself. To participate in constituting a group is to have certain types of knowledge of the group, of its member, and forms of interaction. I mean, this recalls a key motif from Völkerpsychologie, the Lazarus version, namely that what is a group, what is a folk, what is an institution? Well, it's those people who regard each other as a folk or as an institution. So it's the, what we nowadays associate with John Searle or Tourmela or Gilbert, namely the idea that an institution is constituted by collective belief is essential elements in Simmel and in Lazarus. And that's why Simmel says that the conditions of possibility of the social sciences is a certain form of knowledge in the actors themselves. The actors must regard each other as a group in order to constitute a group. And in that sense, that belief that we are a group makes itself into knowledge simply by being collectively endorsed. Okay, but the key point here is that the core question of the social sciences, namely how is a community possible, the core of sociology is epistemology. The key question of how are societies possible is answered by epistemology, not by sociology. That's very different from what he said before. Another Husserlian and Neo-Kantian theme emerges when Simmel rejects strong forms of sociology of knowledge, where here by strong, I mean a form of sociology of knowledge that disrespects the validity-credibility distinction. Here's a key quote from Simmel, quote, "The inner validity of all sciences and arts is fully independent of whether or not they are realized in social life. Just like their objective meaning is independent of the psychological processes that led to their discovery. It is totally legitimate to investigate which social conditions made possible the natural sciences as we know them now. But the correctness of their propositions, the aptness or inaptness of their methods have no social criterion. They are unaffected by the facts of their social historical occurrence and are exclusively subject to immanent, timeless, that is, objective norms." That's a complete repudiation of what Simmel says in 1892-93, and indeed what he says in the Pragmatism paper of 1885. I have already indicated that the very strong Neo-Kantian and perhaps Husserlian flavor is a new element in Simmel's reflection on sociology, though we saw elements of it in Simmel's early Probleme der Geschichtswissenschaft. Such Neo-Kantian elements, to repeat, are that each science has its own a priori conditions, that the sciences result from abstractions, the central role for the form content, and the validity-causality distinctions. The interest in almost timeless forms or essences of interaction also, of course, has a Neo-Kantian or phenomenological flavor. And this focus explains why relativism never appears in the Soziologie. Of course, there are also many Diltheian elements here, but perhaps the differences with Dilthey are more important. Simmel rejects the idea of a special position for psychology or the privileging of the world of social historical experience. Finally, and this is kind of politically interesting, remember that in the philosophy of money, the most important form of social interaction is exchange. And in light of that central idea, the most important form of social interaction is exchange. It's striking that in the 1908 sociology, exchange is never mentioned with one word. That's kind of an indicative of a certain political change or political caution that characterizes the 1908 book. Okay, then let me say very briefly something about the 1917 book, Grundfragen. Recent scholarship has rightly emphasized that the Grundfragen is more than a mere abridged version of the 1908 book. But this is not to deny that many of the themes of the 1908 sociology are kept, but there are also novelties. One of these is the repeated emphasis on the idea that changes in economic relations are part of superstructure. So note, the economic relations are not the base, but the economic relations are the superstructure. The base, instead, are fundamental forms of interaction. So rather than making the economic the basis of interactions, now the economic becomes the product of interactions and forms of interaction that are not themselves economic. Another novelty is the form-content distinction that is now very closely tied to the philosophy of life that Simmel had developed in recent years. But this only deepened the one-sided dependence of sociology on philosophy. Let me just remind you very briefly what the essential elements of the philosophy of life for Simmel were. Life is a dynamic temporal process of immediate experience and creative, influenced clearly by Bergson. It creates forms, namely atemporal structures like the ideational worlds of science, art, or religion, or social institutions and forms of interaction. Originally, these forms are created to serve life, but over time they become life's new purposes, and they can come to restrict and hinder life. So the very forms that are created to make life more livable can turn around and come to restrict life. And this theme, of course, owes less to the Neo-Kantians and much more to Nietzsche, Eucken, Schopenhauer, Goethe, and, of course, Dilthey. The book consists of 4 chapters. I will here only say something about chapter 4, which is entitled Philosophical Sociology, and investigates the question, what is the ultimate relationship between individual and society? So again, that's a question that philosophy of history is meant to answer this question rather than sociology itself. And he calls this philosophical sociology. Well, what is his analysis here? Here's a thumbnail sketch. He says, quote, the socially valid forms of life of the 18th century were insufficient relative to the material and intellectual forces of production of the time. So that starts off like a good old Marxist text. But this materialist motif is short-lived because he says the dissatisfaction with the forms of life of the 18th century triggered demands for freedom. Intellectuals felt that if only the unacceptable constraints were removed, humans would return to their natural states. And this idea rested on the new conception of laws of nature as the highest ideal of knowledge, and encouraged a focus on the general human being. And Simmel writes that Kant's categorical imperative is the, quote, highest intellectual sublimation of the underlying idea of the individual, namely that in every individual there is the same human nature. Simmel calls this the quantitative individualistic conception of freedom, and he says it was in tension with equality. The freedom that's the same in everyone does not guarantee equality as it is. And he says there were historically 3 responses. The first was the idea of freedom without equality. This was the liberalist emphasis on unrestricted competition. I learned yesterday that that seems to be the Brazilian way of life. The second was equality without freedom, namely socialism. But Simmel thinks that there may be a third response that he thinks is the deepest, namely the so-called qualitative individualism of Goethe. The idea is not to free the common essence, but for each one to achieve a unique individuality. Simmel claims that the idea of division of labor is closely intertwined with this idea of unique individuality. Well, the question is then becomes what determines which of these conceptions one adopts? And at this point, Simmel falls once more back on differential psychology and says, well, there may be basic character types that determine which one of these one adopts. And he says they are the last instance where argument ends. So there's no more social political analysis of the personality types as he did 30 years earlier, but now they are basic. Finally, Simmel considers the relationship between the two economic principles, division of labor and competition on the one hand, and the different forms of individuality, quantitative and qualitative on the other hand. And he asked the question, are the economic principles the sublimations of the philosophical ideas, or are the philosophical ideas the sublimation of the economic ideas? And he considers it briefly and answers it by saying, quote, perhaps they both spring from one of these deep changes in history that we are unable to grasp in their true essence or motif. So basically, he sits on the fence. Okay, summary. The neo-Kantian model of 1908 can be summed up as expressing a one-sided dependence of sociology upon philosophy. Philosophy situates the social sciences relative to other disciplines and studies the social sciences' preconditions and metaphysical consequences. What is more, sociology is construed in the image of an eidetic science, and at its heart sits the epistemology of society constituting beliefs. The 1917 conception drops the strong Husserlian and neo-Kantian overtones. No more mention of intuition and a greater appreciation for the variety of questions to be addressed by sociology. The neo-Kantian and phenomenological emphasis are not gone, of course, but the rigid machinery of neo-Kantian theorizing is softened by Simmel's homegrown and original philosophy of life. But this does not change the one-sided dependence. Sociology remains dependent upon philosophy's theorizing, only now the theorizing about life. Note the wide variety of proposals. So forms of interaction are seen as the base. Social conditions trigger philosophical thoughts, ideas. I won't summarize all of that here. I'm on the wrong page, that's why. Okay. So as far as the overall conclusions I offer, let me first of all say that, remind you what I've tried to do in this paper is to explain that Simmel had different conceptions on the relationship between philosophy and the social sciences. He had the replacement model of 1892, the tight coupling model of 1900, and the neo-Kantian models of 1908 and 1917, and in the latter case, two different but related versions. And it seems to me that all three models are still with us. Let me just give one brief indication of this. Think of the Wittgensteinians in the philosophy of the social sciences, for instance, of David Bloor or Peter Winch. Wittgenstein memorably writes in the Blue Book that, quote, the subject matter that we, meaning he, are dealing with is one of the heirs of the subject which used to be called philosophy. So there is a replacement model clearly in Wittgenstein. And Bloor in his 1893 book, Wittgenstein, The Social Theory of Knowledge, slots in his relativistic sociology of knowledge as being that air Wittgenstein must have had in mind. For Bloor, epistemology is misbegotten sociology. This is clearly the replacement model. Much of the philosophy of the social sciences, again, seems to me today is committed to the neo-Kantian model. This is especially clear in Peter Winch's influential little classic, The Idea of the Social Science, and its relation to philosophy. Winch wants to show that the social sciences are, quote, a scheme of concepts which is logically incompatible with the kinds of explanation offered by the natural sciences, classical neo-Kantian motif, that social relations are expressions of ideas about reality, and, quote, sociology is really misbegotten epistemology. That is exactly the position that Simmel ends up with. Personally, I have to admit that I cannot get very excited about either the replacement model or the neo-Kantian model. I've argued for this elsewhere, and I can't repeat my arguments here. But I will say that, warts and all, Simmel's tight coupling model of the Philosophie des Geldes remains for me, in any case, an inspiration and challenge. And it pains me that there's such a dearth of monographs and papers that follow a similar model. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for a very enlightening lecture, Professor Kusch. Yeah, this commentator role is always tricky, because it's, I mean, you have to find a way through such a very fine-grained paper like yours. And there's another dimension that I was expecting the presentation of the full thing. So I have a really short text, and but at the same time I will talk just a little bit about the two former papers on his pragmatism and the moral debate. But I think that mainly because of some of these summing ups that you provide, I think that it's very interesting to connect them, and I think it's a very good opportunity to hear you connecting those topics. So, Professor Kusch's lecture deals with three aspects of Simmel's works, at least it would be in the former version. Each one bringing its own set of questions. One of the most remarkable features of each of that three parts is how complex is the image that emerges of Simmel's thought. In all the three topics dealt by Professor Kusch, Simmel seems to be trying to attain a more sophisticated or fine-grained in-between positions. Even when it comes to his relations to pragmatism, the point is not so much concerning to if he is or if he is not a pragmatist, but since he's trying to move away from a theory of truth as a correspondence, how to formulate a consistent alternative and useful notion of it. However, what Professor Kusch calls, and I quote, the axial rotation in Simmel's epistemology, stresses the necessity of somehow going beyond a purely and strictly understood biological evolutionary terms, even though it's not Simmel's position lacking an important feature, namely dealing with something like our knowledge, for example, of the things like third realm, or therefore something that seems to be quite distinct of usefulness prima facie. Even compared to other pragmatist epistemologies like Persis, for instance, isn't Simmel's too, so to speak, flat? And I guess one of the reasons to that is that Simmel's, as you show in the last part, Simmel's feels like pushed to reframe his epistemology. Concerning now his account on moral science, we can notice also here how Simmel is trying to grasp a not naive view on the relation between freedom and moral responsibility. It seems to me that Simmel and Paul Hess' debate on it is very interesting, even in more contemporary terms of the problem of compatibilism, which in contemporary meta-ethics means the problem of reconciliation of determinism and moral responsibility. If on the one hand, Hess seems to be an incompatibilist who stresses the necessity of free will in order to be possible moral responsibility of agents, which is an unusual approach even nowadays, Simmel's position is quite interesting when saw through the contemporary lenses. When he says, and I quote, "We are not responsible because we are free, but the other way around," end quote. He's breaking the traditional bound between those two concepts. He's not only breaking the traditional bound, but he's melting the very problem itself. How do you see, Professor, Simmel's position concerning such a debate against this contemporary background of the problem of compatibilism? And finally, concerning the problem of relations between philosophy and sociology, Simmel's analysis of this threefold relation between philosophy and sociology is also an example of Simmel's effort in attaining a less simplistic approach. However, when he say in the end that, and I quote you, ethics needs to be replaced by moral science, a combination of psychology, social science, and history, seems to me that he's not merely, but translating the problem of relation of philosophy and sociology now to the problem of relations. Now you have to deal with at least three relations between psychology, social science, and history. Now, so the problem is that was the relation between philosophy and sociology now is translated in terms of three relations, so to speak. And mainly because as you say in the end, different conceptions of philosophy and sociology mean different epistemological conceptions as well. So how you can understand such relations? Because as you say in the very end, in other words, sociology cannot answer its central questions without help from epistemology as its very core. So how we can have a clue on these connections between his former pragmatistic approach on epistemology and this very core and, so to speak, hardcore necessity of epistemological approach, even that have to, as you say, and I quote, the social sciences have to deal with preconditions and metaphysical consequences. So I think that it's how can we understand such way through a very evolutionary / biological approach to epistemology to one of this neo-Kantian approach that even has to deal with a priori metaphysical conditions of sociology and those relations. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, maybe we should as well. So thank you. So let me begin with a general comment of. Oh, okay, yeah. Perfect. Okay, sorry for that. Okay, so let me start with a general comment on why am I writing a book about Simmel. I am not writing a book about Simmel because I think that what Simmel says is right. I'm trying to write a book, this is part of a bigger project on relativism, and we are both in this project trying to understand how different forms of relativistic thoughts, especially in epistemology, are generated and become prevalent in 19th century German and English-speaking philosophy, up until up until the Nazis. That's sort of how far we are trying to follow the debates over relativism. And then the project had a systematic part in which we tried to defend certain forms of relativism. So I'm writing a book on relativism in the philosophy of science today, where I defend a certain form of epistemic relativism. But in this book, Simmel plays little role. I'm writing a second book on Simmel. But this book tries to be historical rather than trying to show that Simmel was right. I find Simmel interesting historically because he's one of the first people who regard themselves as relativists, try to defend relativist views. He's also a fascinating window into a culture and a philosophical debate. Simply because he, as you say, as you picked up on, he participates in very many different debates at the time. So by looking at Simmel, you have to look at many, many debates at the time to which Simmel contributed. But rather than writing a big fat book about all these philosophical debates at the time, I follow Simmel as my red thread through those debates. And so I use Simmel as a way to open up a picture on German debates over philosophy and the social sciences between 1818 and between the 1870s and the 1920s, in which Simmel is interesting because he always got interesting things to say, but not because what Simmel says is always right. Simmel is also interesting because he's not a systematic philosopher. If you take someone like Rickert, he has a certain philosophical program, it seems when I look at his work, which he follows single-mindedly throughout his life. Simmel contributes to very many different debates about aesthetics, about ethics, about philosophy of life, about economic theorizing. And this is why, by looking at Simmel, one gets a perspective on all these various debates. So that's just in terms of motivation. I say that because to explain why I am not trying to extract from Simmel a theory of freedom that would be an important contribution to contemporary debates about compatibilism. Of course, I notice similarities, but they help me in some cases to reconstruct what Simmel says more clearly, without that I'm very interested in whether what Simmel says is right or wrong. I'm more interested in trying to understand how Simmel and his contemporary argued about those things, and less how we today would evaluate what Simmel does. So that's just in terms of some stage setting for what I'm trying to do. I'm also, this book about Simmel has a certain, if you like, reflective perspective, because I claim in the book that Simmel is one of the first people to systematically try to do a sociology of philosophical knowledge. You're trying to understand by means of the social sciences why certain philosophical views become prevalent. And I'm turning that very method back on Simmel himself. So I'm trying to understand, why does Simmel make certain statements? What is his social, political context? All the way up to the gender question, because we mustn't forget that Simmel's wife, Marie-Louise von Enzendorf, under the title under which she wrote her book, was an important philosopher in her own right and wrote 4 books about philosophy. Simmel and her were close to the George circle, and in fact, Stefan George thought that Simmel's wife was the greater philosopher in that family. Okay, so I could talk about that aspect at length, but I won't do, because I want to address your question. So you had like 4 questions really. The first one is whether there are intellectual links between the arguments of those 3 papers. And clearly, the first paper, in its focus on Simmel as a pragmatist, presents a Simmel with a certain reductive program. I mean, the replacement model is not directly there in the 1885 paper on pragmatism, but what is very strongly there, that it needs biological theorizing to understand fundamental philosophical concepts, like the concept of truth. So clearly that is one important link. And this pragmatist theme Later, I mean, initially it's a biological theme. Later, just like generally in the German culture at the time, the biology was more and more turned into what Simmel himself calls less a science of life, but a poetics of life. So the philosophy of life was trying to retain the Darwinian, Spencerian focus of life, but now with completely different resources. So as I tried to argue in the first paper, the biology in Simmel's case is never really given up. Because even what he calls, not I call, the axial rotation, that it's no longer the case that the forms serve life, but life serves the form. That's the axial rotation. So like initially people gain knowledge in order to live. Later they live in order to gain knowledge. That's the axial rotation, right? Even that he gives ultimately a biological explanation. And nowadays we have the term to express what he is edging towards in a bit stricter language, as I tried to do in the paper, by saying, well, he really becomes interested in niche construction. Because niche construction in like biology, if you have a beaver building a dam, right? The dam that the beaver builds for himself creates for the beaver and the children, the offspring of the beaver, a new environment. It's no longer the original biological environment, but an altered biological environment. And then, of course, you got a twofold level of selection. You got the selection within the artificial environment, but you also still have the selection in the larger biological environment. And when Simmel theorizes culture, cultures for him are niches. So that both explains how he moves away from the rather simplistic biological motif, but it also explains a way in which he always remains indebted to it. So he never gives that up. Okay, the second paper with the Nietzsche material actually fits into the story I've just sketched. Because Nietzsche becomes, of course, for everyone in the European context, for the French, for the Italians, for the Germans, forces you to think about life in a new way. The Darwinians and Spencer give you a biological way to think about life, and now Nietzsche offers you a new way to theorize about life. And Simmel is intrigued by this perspective. He's not willing to go over and become a Nietzschean. This is why I present him as kind of halfway between Rey's Darwinian position and the Nietzschean position. Simmel tries to locate himself in between. Whether that is ultimately successful is a separate question, but that's clearly how he saw himself. And this is a debate that Germans in the German debate over the book at the time never picked up on. Somehow what caught attention was the purely negative element, namely there is someone who is trying to replace philosophy with the social sciences. But at the same time, the book tries to do genealogies in a new key, not in the Nietzschean key, but in a new key, was kind of lost. And if I can just make in brackets a link to something systematic, I'm quite interested, and I've written a lot about the work by Edward Craig and Bernard Williams, contemporary authors who are trying to do epistemology in a new key. Bernard Williams calls it genealogies of knowledge. And I see Simmel as an early contributor to such types of themes that only nowadays, because nowadays systematic philosophy has become interested in this, we can to some extent better appreciate what people like Simmel were trying to do. Okay. Then you made a systematic point and you said, well, if we take on Simmel's approach and we take on board the Darwinian scheme, even including the niche construction, isn't that too flat a conception of knowledge and can't explain and take account of knowledge of what you call knowledge of the third realm, as like Frege called it das Dritte Reich, so the ideal objects outside of space and time. Well, Simmel had different positions on this. In his later work, increasingly he is trying to escape the criticism of Husserl and the Neo-Kantians and make some vague gestures into acknowledging such a third realm. Personally, I think that's the less interesting Simmel. There he becomes too concessive. Since in my own work I have lots of sympathies for the both the biological approaches to human knowledge and to the sociological approaches to human knowledge. I think this earlier project is not doomed by objections like how can you account for the third realm, since after all we have models for how people with a naturalistic bent can explain away third realms. I mean, this kind of approaches existed at the time already. You had people like Wilhelm Jerusalem, for example, in Vienna. Also, of course, Jewish, as the name gives away. That's why he couldn't get a job in the universities. But he was trying to develop, and he wrote a whole book in answer to Husserl, in which he tried to explain how a combination of biology and sociology and pragmatism can account for the phenomenon that for which Husserl thinks we need something like a third realm. So clearly there are ways. I'm not saying these versions are ultimately successful. All I'm saying is that the criticism, how can you explain the realm of the ideational, as they used to call it, on the basis of the biological? Well, there were models on how to do that. And to make the link to Simmel's sociological theorizing, if you look at how someone like Hilary Cornblyth or someone like David Bloor try to account for these phenomena that for Simmel, for which Husserl and Frege think they need a third realm, they do it with the concept of an institution. Institutional facts are the sort of facts that are third realm facts. But that's no more than a promissory note, but just to say that there are possibilities for Simmel to answer here. This thing about that Simmel says we are not responsible because we are free, but we are free because we are responsible. To me, I didn't really link that primarily to contemporary debates about compatibilism. To me, the immediate link was to a book by Barry Barnes called, what's it called? Something like An Analogy of Agency. Barry Barnes, the sociologist and philosopher of the social sciences, because that's a sociological analysis of freedom of the will. And I was intrigued by the fact that Simmel's analysis to understand the metaphysics of freedom of the will, we have to turn to an analysis about what attributions of freedom do for us in everyday social contexts. This sort of turning a metaphysical question into a sociological question. That is common to some writers today, like Barnes and Simmel. Incidentally, it's also, of course, a theme, even if one doesn't agree in every way or form with Bloor's, say, reading of Wittgenstein. That is also a key feature in Wittgenstein. And I've written a book defending Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein, where the central idea is that to understand meaning is to look at the social function of meaning attributions. And Simmel is doing something similar with freedom, to understand how our intuitions about freedom come about. We have to look at the social function of attributions of freedom. This, I think, is an interesting idea, and it's in common with Simmel and certain contemporary authors. The third question, you said, if we take Simmel seriously, that the social sciences replace philosophy, and he says that psychology, social science, and history do the replacement, don't we then have a new problem of how these fields relate to one another? Yes, indeed. And of course, this is both a problem for Simmel, but it's also, of course, a contemporary problem. Because if you look, say, about the debates around the sociology of knowledge, say the Barnes-Bloor program, they are critiqued both from more traditional philosophical positions, but also critiqued by cognitive science guys who think that the sort of thing that sociologists try to explain have already been explained by the cognitive sciences. There remains nothing left to explain. There were similar such turf wars over who explains the other side away, also, of course, between those fields. So there were tensions between those fields then, and of course there are tensions between those fields now. So there's nothing really new there. It's intriguing to see that I was at a conference by the annual European Association for Philosophy of Social Science, in Hanover this summer, and I normally don't attend their meetings. That was my first time, and I was intrigued that for them the most important question seems to be nowadays whether the social sciences reduce to cognitive science, which to me is a completely uninteresting question, for the simple reason that we are so far away from getting anywhere close to such a reduction that to have this fight now seems to me to be 100 years too early. Let's return to that question when there is such a base in cognitive science. So, but that already was a debate that occurred in those days, where of course people like Wundt, insofar as they tried to give the psychological underpinnings for the social sciences, were attempting such reductions of the sociological to the psychological. And you then ask a question about epistemology, given that for Simmel epistemology is so central.
No, it was precisely about that connection that you mentioned earlier. So
Right.
So epistemology and the whole thing through. So
Right.
It was
Yeah. So it's important to note that whereas the early Simmel seems to me to incline towards thinking we replace epistemology by the social sciences, the later Simmel no longer thinks that. He thinks that there are normative questions we can raise about knowledge that are not already decided within the social sciences, though he remains firm in the view that an epistemology, how does the Kantian phrase go, like an epistemology without the social sciences is empty, a sociology without philosophy is blind. So I think he has something like this sort of Kantian, then also Lakatos uses this metaphor. So there's something like that in his later work.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kusch. So now we have some time for a couple questions. So here we go. Professor Betty.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about, it's starting to meet this idea about condensation of your content. I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. So if I understand this, there's something from Hamburg. Is the idea that condensation, and then you said something about how concepts come about. Is it only about their origin, like how we come to concept? It's not that we know what concepts are, correct? Or not? Or is it both?
It's both. It's a theory about concepts are, how they come about, and also how they develop over time. So maybe okay, no, ask, go on. Yeah.
So how they come about and how they change is not the same thing
No.
as even an intelligent concept. And it's possible that they really don't want to do that. They say simply tiny. It's really, what we do with concepts is simply, how they form, how they change. But of course, you may be completely not committed over what you are. Is this correct? Trying to
Well, I'm not so competent to speak about Herbart. So let me just, well, I mean, the bit that I know reasonably well is the Berlin Völker psychology tradition, for which that is the central idea, the condensation of concept. And then I know a bit what Simmel does with it. And in fact, this idea of concept as condensation goes all the way to Ludwig Fleck. And of course to Freud. Freud says that concepts are condensations. So it's an enormously influential idea in the second half of the 19th century, all the way to, well, in fact, even someone like Hans-Jörg Reinberger today, who is a historian of science. When Reinberger studies scientific concepts, he studies them as condensations. So it's an idea with a very long historical trajectory. So let me say a little bit more about this idea. In Herbart, you have this, the key thought in Herbart is that you have narrow consciousness. Like there's only so much ever fits into consciousness. But we have many more ideas in memory and so on than actually fit into the narrow consciousness. So therefore, you have to compress ideas. A concept compresses ideas in that it's no longer fully transparent to you. Actually, what all is in the concept. So, concept can be a concept can be ideological in a way. It's also a way to study ideological sides of concepts, that a concept compresses ideas and you don't even quite know what all is contained in this concept. So the question is then, well, how are those condensed concepts present, right? Are they somewhere in the subconscious, or are they somewhat in other forms present? And Simmel develops the thesis that the way in which condensed concepts are passed on is as dispositions to apply the concept. And then, of course, you need to ask, well, how was this disposition generated? And then, of course, you need to know what was the original context where these ideas were compressed and survive as dispositions on how to use the concept. But it's important to add that this model does not fix concepts once and for all. So it is possible that a concept is a disposition and then the disposition is passed on. But it's also important to the idea that there are two other ideas that are linked to this idea of concepts. One idea is the idea of apperception, also a Herbartian idea, but of course also a Kantian idea. Namely that we never just see things without influence, but every perception is an apperception. So every perception is in light of your concepts. And that, of course, is an early version of the, if you like, the concept-ladenness of observation. And if you look at some of the writings in the Zeitschrift für Völkerpsychologie, I'm thinking, for example, of a very long paper by Emil Wohlwill on the history of chemistry, that is really a study that centrally focuses on theory-ladenness of observation in science. Quite striking that someone so early on writes about such issues. Okay, so a perception is the one idea. So these concepts that we have color what we perceive. And the second bit is that the application of concepts is always interest-driven. So we never just apply concept out of the blue, but the concept's application is always in a certain constellation of interests and goals, and these can change the content of the concept. Then comes the question, how come we have the same concept? So how come we have the same dispositions to apply the concept? The first thing they say is, we don't have the same concepts. There is only a similarity between our concepts, but the dispositions can be quite dissimilar, and it needs a social process of adjustment to make sure we have roughly the same apperception. So if you then say, well, where's the ontology? Simmel would say, once you have told that, you have given the ontology. There's nothing more to be said, right? Which is another reason why they would say there's no need for a third realm. I mean, there's no need for a third realm of concepts, because that explains all there is to be explained,
so
right?
I would say there is no need for the third realm as a consequence of that.
Yes.
But it's not the same. I mean,
No.
could have an ontology of concept that is numinous or whatever.
Yes.
It doesn't do anything the third realm is rejecting, but it's the third way to look at that.
Yeah.
I think what is really interesting is this extreme difference of distribution, which I was completely
Yeah.
not conversant with. And what even some of the Britannians were doing when they give a list of features of Merkmale of a concept, the
Yes.
difference between concept intuitions and the typical Kant-Bolzano that
Yeah.
the Wolf-inspired tradition of
Yes.
Kant.
Yes.
And this is completely alternative, and thank you for
Yes. No, I mean, I've written a lengthy paper. I think you're the only person in the audience who has heard it. You were at this conference on Völkerpsychologie, and so sorry if I'm repeating myself. So wrote a longish paper on the Berlin Völkerpsychology tradition and why it has broken off. And I gave some indications in this paper why it broke off, because of the political aspects, Steinthal being a socialist, and the link to the Antisemitismus strike. And of course, the important thing to remember, Steinthal and Lazarus were also extraordinarius professors, so they didn't have PhD students. And how could you start a school if you have no PhD students? And of course, the other Berlin philosophers, like Dilthey, Zeller, and the others, were of course extremely hostile towards this kind of project, right? They were trying to do philosophy in a new key. And then, of course, the combination of things sound quite awkward to us, combining Hegel, Darwin, Spencer, some of the German scientists of the time, and were trying to create something out of that. Some bits are bits of sheer brilliance. Other bits to us look artificial. But of course, it's always when we look into the history of philosophy, that's some bits look.
I found very interesting that he, in the 18th century and no 19th century,
Yep.
sorry, already tried to do a genealogy of society and see the moral how was in the first societies and forward. And I'm interested in his influence that he gave to other philosophers like Foucault, who tried to make a genealogy of humanity and the history of prison, sexuality, and so although he's not the most known philosopher, I would like to see his influence.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, one should emphasize that what Simmel was doing looks to us now quite unusual and strange. If we look to the perspective of, say, the Brentano school or the phenomenologists or the neo-Kantians, then it seems quite strange. But in the context of the 19th century, that was not quite so outré, because if you look at what they were doing in England at the time, Darwin, Spencer, and the many lesser lights writing around this, or even going as far back as Hume. Well, Hume was already trying to naturalize important concepts in both ethics and epistemology. So there was a strong empiricist tradition and genealogical tradition. I mean, Spencer writes 10 volumes trying to lead back concepts to ethical concepts to an original communist form of social life and tries to explain it on that basis. So they could use a lot of theorizing that was already there. So they're not quite so unique as it looks from today's perspective. Okay, that's the one thing. The other thing, the links to the French, let me widen the issue to the French and then Foucault. Even though Simmel had a hard time getting quite the recognition he wanted in Germany, he did not have a similar problem abroad. For example, more than 25 of his papers were translated into English and published in the United States at the time. In fact, in Chicago. And it's often been remarked that the later Chicago school in the social sciences was very strongly influenced by Simmel's interactionist idea of sociology, namely that sociology is the study of types of interaction. So he has a considerable influence there. Later with Parsons and sort of more structuralist form of sociology, he became less important, but then he has had several revivals and is essential figure, essential sort of within the canon of important sociologists in the North American context. In France, the reception was more complicated because Durkheim saw Simmel as a competitor. Durkheim thought that he has his vision about what sociology should be, and Simmel had a radically different vision. And so Durkheim early on wanted to cooperate with Simmel and get Simmel to be editor in the journals that Durkheim was setting up. But then when he recognized that Simmel's vision of sociology was so different, he started attacking him. Simmel never replied. Simmel never really replied to any criticism, which is a bit weird, but this is how he wrote. So Durkheim wrote very detailed critical analysis of Simmel, much right in that Durkheim criticism, I have to say. And so that made Simmel a bit more marginal. But several of Simmel's books were already in the early 20th century translated into English, into French and into Italian, actually. And the first paper in which Durkheim attacks Simmel was actually published in Italian, not in French, because the Italians were also so interested in the social sciences coming up. And so Simmel has had some presence there. Now, there are certainly elements that when I read a long time ago, in 1991, I wrote a book about Foucault, but that's very long in my past, and my memory is a bit shaky on it. But I do see certain parallels between Foucault and Simmel. Absolutely, I certainly agree with you. But I doubt very much that Foucault learned that from Simmel. The sort of things that Foucault does, he could have learned from many, many different sources, Nietzsche and the French Annales school and the French sociological tradition. So while it cannot be ruled out that Simmel was an influence there, I doubt that it was a very important influence. Yeah.
Professor Silva.
Hello. Hey, thank you, Professor Kusch, for your very fine-grained and detailed presentation. I'm not familiar with Simmel, but I think I've learned a lot from your presentation. And one thing that strikes me is how difficult it can be to use him as a red thread for this whole discussion on discussion on philosophy, sociology, and sociological approach to philosophy, because it's hard to see a red thread in his work, in a sense, in a more general sense, because there's so many topics and areas in psychology and history, sociology and economics, and it's challenging, yeah, I think, to see a leitmotif, yeah, throughout that. And I have two questions here. Just trying to hear more from you, and maybe you can elaborate on that, on these two topics. The first one is on this last slide, on this tight coupling. You see there's a more there's an inspiration for contemporary discussions, in a sense. Yeah? You don't really like the new Kantian model and the replacement model. Yeah? And I was wondering if it is connected, this tight coupling can be connected to this Wittgensteinian approach to philosophy in a more general sense. You already mentioned these institutional facts and the meaning as used, semantics, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Okay.
Because if I got it right, Simmel has a very realist approach to these facts, yeah, these social facts. And I don't really see if that match with Wittgensteinian approach to that. I see it more anti-realist and using the concept of rule and concept of norms, and don't have to have a kind of substitution with the reality or the facts. That's the kind of challenge that I see there. And the second question is a more, you mentioned some, but didn't develop the idea of a connection and a long tradition of a connection of logic and morality. And that was kind of puzzling for me, because bringing that to contemporary discussions, because we have this logic nowadays as a more scientific approach to knowledge, and is a kind of tool to develop knowledge, and scientific knowledge and connect to natural sciences, in a sense, and mathematics, and mathematical logic. And using this approach, it's hard to see how moral has to do with that. Yeah? So maybe you can discuss about it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So there were three things I wanted to comment on. The first one is that you said it's hard to see the leitmotif in Simmel. And I think that's right, because I don't think there is a leitmotif in Simmel. No. I mean, there are different types of intellects. There are certain people that throughout their life follow a certain program and stick with that very closely. There are other people like Simmel, and of course on a lower level like myself, are interested in very many different things, write about very different things at different times over their life, and perhaps even at the same time. And it's very hard to identify how this all hangs together. I mean, but I can't see that the one is more valuable than the other, because you can only judge it by the fruits. And there is certainly intellectual virtue to spending many, many years on one and the same problem. But there's also sometimes intellectual virtue in training yourself in understanding very many different problems, and then being able to bring what you've learned in that area to bear on another area. So there are costs and benefits to both of those things. And if there is such a thing, Simmel also wants to explain things with differential psychology. I think that's largely a personality question, whether one likes the fixation on one key question, or whether one enjoys being a butterfly and flying from one interesting problem to another. So in that sense, I'm not searching for a leitmotif in Simmel. And when I write the book about him, it's precisely not to write the book about Simmel on the basis of a leitmotif, but rather to explain and explore this entanglement of very many different motifs. So that's my interest there. Then you asked me the question about whether there is a link between the tight coupling model and Wittgenstein. And well, the problem with Wittgenstein, and having just subsumed myself under the butterfly characters, I also have written a little bit about Wittgenstein, so which gives me the courage to say something about this. Namely, I think just as one can identify these different models in Simmel, rather different models to conceive of what philosophy is, I also think that in Wittgenstein you have actually very different models about what philosophy actually should be and could achieve. And not only the model of like the Tractatus and the model of the late writings, but there are further important divisions about how Wittgenstein conceives of the role of philosophy in the 1930s and how he conceives of the role of philosophy when he writes the comments about certainty. So it is hard to subsume Wittgenstein under a clear label and then relate that to Simmel. I think there are many interesting small-scale parallels between Simmel and Wittgenstein. For example, I find Simmel's analysis of religion surprisingly similar to certain things that Wittgenstein writes when he writes this lecture series in the late 1930s about religious belief. I find there rather striking similarities between the two. I also find certain similarities between Wittgenstein's uncertainty and Simmel's ideas about different social cultural niches with their own certainty. So I see some similarities there. But I would disagree with you in saying that our Simmel is a realist and Wittgenstein is some kind of anti-realist. Well, one of my favorite texts in philosophy was written by a philosopher who otherwise I don't agree with at all, namely Susan Haag. She wrote a paper in 1988 called Realism, in quotation marks, in the Synthese. And the thing is, the reason why I like this paper is that she there argues that realism as such means nothing. There are about 70 different things that people mean by realism. And so therefore, there are certainly features of Simmel that we could call realist, but there are certainly features in Wittgenstein we could call realist. There are anti-realist elements in both of them, so I find it hard to say the one is a realist thinker and the other one isn't a realist thinker. So I don't think there is a clear answer to this question in those terms. And finally, you said that Simmel makes this, brings closely together morality and logic, whereas you want to say that logic and morality don't really have that much to do with one another. Well, remember that Simmel does so in a very specific context. Namely, he says, when Kant applies his tests, whether a maxim can be generalized, right? That's the test for moral status. Can the maxim be generalized? The question is, how do we find out whether it can be generalized? So if we do this by imagining a situation in which everyone acted on the maxim. But now the question is, how do we evaluate that situation when we test whether the maxim can be generalized? Well, if Kant says we evaluate that situation in moral terms, but then Kant's analysis would be circular. You need already morality in order to judge whether the categorical imprint, whether the maxim can be generalized. So, says Simmel, in order to escape that circularity in his analysis, Kant falls back on assessing the situation in which the maxim is generalized in purely conceptual terms, in purely logical conceptual terms, not in moral terms. So that's the criticism. And Simmel says, rightly or wrongly, we could test that for different historical figures, that many figures in the history of moral theory have equally tried to somehow reduce moral reasoning to reasoning in other domains. And that he finds problematic. So that's the link there. I don't think what you were saying about logic being in the service of science and so on, that may or may not be true, but that's kind of irrelevant for the issue here. Yeah?
Yeah. So, what you said about Simmel's relation to Kant, I mean, my impression is that in general Kant played merely an instrumental role for Simmel, because he wasn't really a Kantian in a serious sense. And even I think in 1908 it seems to be a purely strategic move to include this Kantian chapter. I mean, that was your suggestion. But I mean, do you see it exactly in this way, that, well, I mean, we shouldn't count Simmel as related in some important way to Neo-Kantianism, but only in an instrumental way, because he was looking for a position, more or less, and as a Jew you had to take sides, and then you go on the strongest side. So you had big chances. And just a remark on perhaps a possible connection between Simmel and the Brentano school. Perhaps you know about this, but Masaryk wrote a review of Simmel's book, which actually is not, well, I mean, his basic point is to say, well, what does it have to do with Kant? And I think it's I mean, taking Masaryk's diagnosis, I think it also supports that kind of instrumental account of Simmel's Kantianism, if there is any.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let me start with the second point, the Masaryk criticism. That's Masaryk's review of Simmel's sociology, right? And I mean, to me, the main criticism there was rather that was not so much the Kantianism was the main issue, but the main point of the criticism was that Simmel lacks a systematic way of structuring his material. So Simmel has like these 8 chapters, and in each chapter he kind of seems to be stitching together rather different motifs, and it was hard to see what were the overarching principles. That was a criticism that others made too, but I think few made it as forcefully as Masaryk did it. And I think much of that criticism is probably right. So that's yeah, there's no doubt about that. And also there are very few remarks in Simmel where he would actually comment on Brentano and the Brentano school. So I think there was, other than that review by Masaryk, there was very little interaction between the two. On the first question, there one can say more. And the first thing one should ask here, what does it take to be a Kantian, and what does it take to be a Neo-Kantian? Also, of course, there's the question relating to my first part of my talk, what is it to be a pragmatist? I mean, we had a big conference in Vienna where I gave this paper on the pragmatism, and everyone there tried to define what a pragmatist was every talk, and we had as many pragmatists that we had talks. But the same, of course, is true for Kant and Neo-Kantians. Because what is it to be a Neo-Kantian in this time? How much of Kant do you have to keep to still be a Neo-Kantian? Is it enough to be a Kantian if you write a lot about Kant? And that certainly Simmel did. I mean, he wrote his dissertation about it. He won a prize for his dissertation for the best Kant scholarship in Berlin. His Habilitation was on Kant. He wrote 3 books in which Kant is in the title. And in almost every single book, he takes issue with something in Kant. So he's certainly Kantian if one means that Kant sets for him the central framework of questions to be addressed, even when you turn against Kant. So in that sense, one take the Kant out and there's little left of Simmel because so much of it is a response to Kant. So I wouldn't, well, this, as far as the purely strategic is concerned, well, I think there are some clear strategic things in Simmel. Sometimes it's hard to be sure, just is it strategic or has he really changed his mind? It's always in those sorts of questions, of course. But it's not purely strategic that he thinks throughout his life that Kant defines what it is to be a modern human being in a highly influential way. He thinks that Nietzsche has given us a way to correct the Kantian model, but Simmel clearly thinks that you cannot understand the modern world without understanding Kant and his influence. And he thinks that for many key philosophical questions, the first key hurdle you have to take to be in the philosophical realm is to engage with Kant. So in that sense, he is absolutely essential in the neo-Kantian tradition. The rest of it, it seems to me, then what then becomes sort of political is the categorizing itself, because when like neo-Kantians want to say, but Simmel isn't really a neo-Kantian. Well, they do this because they try to promote a particular image of what neo-Kantianism at its best was, and then he isn't part of it. So for someone who is trying to bring Darwin into Kantianism, well, that to many neo-Kantians is anathema. But of course, there were also neo-Kantians at the time who thought that that was perfectly legitimate, right? So, so my overall answer would be that I don't think there is a clear answer to the question whether he was a neo-Kantian or not. And maybe as historians of philosophy, we shouldn't be so concerned about getting the boxes clean. It's more interesting to try to reconstruct why did the historical actors think that the line was there rather than somewhere else? That to me, at least for my Simmel studies, is the interesting question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
There was a moment in your lecture that remained a little obscure to me.
Mm-hmm.
You were referring to underlining point in the concepts of the Simmel. Sorry, let me rephrase it.
Mm-hmm.
When Simmel talks about society and the construction of knowledge, he had a direct, ambivalent relation between the two concepts. And I didn't understand your point clearly. So I would very like, so if you could repeat, please.
Yeah, okay. If I understand you correctly, this concerns this excursus in Simmel's sociology, where he's trying to explain in what sense the
Society.
epistemology is key to the possibility of societies. That was the issue, right?
Yes.
Am I? Okay, great. Okay, let me explain it starting from contemporary terms, which sometimes are helpful for understanding the past. So think about how someone like John Searle would analyze what a social institution is, like money. It's Searle's favorite example. Every time he gives the example, he takes a $1 bill and holds it in front of his audience. So what makes a piece of paper money? Answer: what makes a piece of paper money is that there is a group of people who are willing to treat it as money. They are willing to treat and to believe that this piece of paper has the status of money. Now, if one person believes that, it doesn't become money. If a group of children thinks it is money, what they draw on a piece of paper, it's not money. But if there is a sufficient number of people who all believe that this piece of paper is money and are willing to behave accordingly, then actually their belief that this piece of paper is money is not just a belief, it's also knowledge. Because the moment everyone believes the paper to be money, the belief that the paper is money is true and is justified. And barring Gettier conditions, this piece of paper is money. So to that extent, in the case of social institutions are constituted by interlocking beliefs, and if the beliefs are interlocked in the right kind of way, the beliefs become true and become knowledge. Now, Simmel thinks that for such types of reasons, the heart of answering how are societies and their institutions possible, the heart of the answer lies with epistemology. Why? Well, because epistemology studies what knowledge is. Let's say knowledge is justified true belief for brevity's sake. So in order to understand how such beliefs make societies possible, we need to understand what knowledge is, and that is what epistemology does. So there is a form of epistemology that studies self-referential beliefs, beliefs that in virtue of being beliefs that other people also have beliefs about, constitute objects with a certain social status. That's why epistemology is the heart of social theory for Simmel. And the what is sometimes called the reflexive model of social institutions can explain why the thought comes so natural to Simmel. And it's not artificial. I'm not importing something into stuff Simmel didn't think, even though, of course, we know this idea is familiar from Simmel. But already in 1860, exactly, in the first number of the Zeitschrift für Völkerpsychologie und Sprachwissenschaft, Lazarus and Steinthal write a paper, what they mean by psychology of people. And one of the central ideas of their text is to say that a folk, a folk is not constituted by blood, it's not constituted by external features, it's not constituted by race, it's not constituted by soil, it's not constituted even by language. But what makes a folk is that you have a group of people that are willing to say of a certain group of people, we are that folk. And that's essentially the Searlean idea. It was at the time, and this is sometimes you need to put in the temporal context just to see how radical an idea that was. It was tremendously radical, because everyone else was thinking that Germanness, the central thing everyone theorized about, was constituted by ethnicity, by language, by looks, whatever. And Treitschke, of course, the famous anti-Semitic historian, thought it was blood. In fact, even Hermann Cohen, the wonderful neo-Kantian, he wrote a paper against Lazarus defending Treitschke. And he's saying that the Lazarus-Steinthal model of social institution, a folk is a group of people who take themselves to be the folk, is wrong. And Treitschke is right, that it's ultimately ethnicity that constitutes a folk. So that's how radical that idea was. And Simmel imports this idea into the foundations of his social theory. Does that clarify that a little bit?
Very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Who else? Nothing else? We really have a couple minutes. Okay. So thank you so very much, Professor Kusch.
Thank you.
Só para lembrá-los, então, nós voltamos agora às 14 horas com a sessão de conferência de professores brasileiros. Vocês podem ver no programa disponível aí. Então, voltamos às 14 horas. We're getting back after lunch, 2 p.m. for conferences, for lectures of Brazilian professors. So I welcome you back afterwards.